Hello and welcome to the New West. Westward expansion in the 19th century transformed the U.S., sparking conflicts with Native Americans, altering the environment, and reshaping society. The government encouraged migration, leading to violence against minority and loss of Native American lands. This period was also significant cultural shifts and environmental changes. The settling of the American West was a pivotal period in U.S. history. After the completion of railroads following the Civil War, vast areas of the West opened up for settlement and economic development. White settlers from the East migrated across the Mississippi River to mine, farm, and ranch. African American settlers also ventured west, lured by the promise of prosperity in all Black Western towns. Chinese railroad workers contributed to the region's diversity. The Great Plains transformed as settlers plowed natural grasses to plant wheat and other crops, impacting the lives of Native Americans. By the 1880s, most Native Americans were confined to reservations. The cowboy emerged as a symbol of the late 19th century West, although their reality was far from glamorous. Recent historians view the West as a crossroads of cultures where various groups vied for property, profit, and cultural dominance. Manifest destiny was a 19th century U.S. belief that the United States was destined by God to expand its borders westward across the North American continent. The phrase was coined in 1845 and expressed the philosophy that drove U.S. territorial expansion. The idea of manifest destiny was used to justify the acquisition of new lands and the spread of democracy and capitalism, while also disregarding the rights and cultures of the Native and Hispanic population. Historians have emphasized that manifest destiny was always contested. Many endorsed the idea, but the large majority of Whigs and many prominent Americans rejected the concept. Historian Daniel Walker Ho writes, American imperialism did not represent an American consensus. It provoked bitter dissent within the national polity. The Homestead Act of 1862 was a law that granted 160 acres of federal land to anyone who agreed to farm the land for 5 years. The act was signed by President Abraham Lincoln and aimed to develop the American West to stimulate economic growth. Revolutionary in distributing public land to private citizens and resulted in millions of acres of Western land being claimed and settled. After the 14th Amendment to the Constitution was passed in 1866, slaves and former slaves became eligible to own land under the Homestead Act. In 1862, Congress had passed the Homestead Act. This law gave every citizen and every foreigner who asked for citizenship the right to claim government land. The Homestead Act was instrumental in the settling of the American West, and especially the plains. Some 45% of land, for example, was successfully homesteaded. The Timber Culture Act was a follow-up act to the Homestead. The Timber Culture Act was passed by Congress and signed into law by President Ulysses S. Grant on March 3, 1873. The act allowed homesteaders to get another 160 acres of land if they planted trees on a quarter of the land, because the land was almost one entire plain of grass. The primary impetus for the act was to alter the climate and ecology of the Great Plains. Scientists in the 19th century believed that substantial afforestation would cause an increase in rainfall, which would enable greater agricultural development. A second motivation was the need for timber on the frontier. 4 years after the Timber Culture Act, Congress passes the Desert Land Act. The original intent of the Desert Land Act was to instigate growth in the West by incentivizing people to move out west in the late 19th century and develop irrigation systems that would transform the land into usable space. While it did encourage growth, it also played a large role in water rights of the era. White settlers decided to move west to spread irrigation rather than use the land solely for farming or cattle. It created a new dilemma for settlers as to how to use and share the water, be it on a communal or an individual basis. While many irrigation systems excuse me, while many irrigation systems were set up communally, that eventually led to private water companies that owned large irrigation systems, which were built independently without consulting. Although the Desert Land Act was partly based on the Homestead Act and the Preemption Act of 1841, it did not contain a key provision of those acts, the residence requirement. While the claimant had to improve the land, the claimant did not need to live on the land while the improvements were made. In the end, that led to a significant amount of fraud, and land speculation companies acquired tens of thousands of acres of California land by hiring dummy entrymen to false claims of settlement. The Act of 1878 in the United States authorized the sale of timberland and surveyed public lands within the states of California, Oregon, Nevada, and in the Washington Territory. Under this act, land that was deemed unfit for farming was sold to any citizen of the United States or any person intending to become a citizen who might want to engage in lodging and mining upon the land. The price of sale was $2.50 per acre, and land was sold in 160-acre blocks. While the intention While the intention was for individual use, speculators often exploited this act to increase their land holdings at minimal expense. In practice, wealthy companies and individuals circumvented the law by acquiring land through fraudulent means, leading to millions of acres being privatized under this act. Ultimately, this legislation transferred vast amounts of land from the public domain to private ownership. Canals were built in the 1820s to 1860s in the United States to lower transport costs, connect Eastern and Western markets, fuel economic growth, and generate water power for manufacturing. Settlers wanted good routes that would connect their settlements to the rivers. The canals offered the most economic and reliable way to transport goods and commodities in large quantities. They improved inland transportation in North America, which was limited to trails and coastal navigation. In the 1860s, the invention and widespread use of stagecoaches played a crucial role in the developed American West. Here's how. Overland transport. Before railroads dominated, stagecoaches were the primary vehicles for overland group transport. They connected towns, cities, and remote areas, allowing people to travel across vast distances. Mail delivery. The post office granted contracts to stagecoach lines to carry mail. These routes helped link Eastern communities with the expanding frontier. During the gold rush, stagecoaches carried mail along the new overland routes all the way to California. Local travel. Even as railroads emerged, rural inhabitants continued to rely on stagecoaches for local travel. Hotels used them to meet trains or take guests sightseeing. Cost reduction. The advent of railroads significantly reduced travel costs. A 6-month stagecoach trip across the United States, it cost around $1,000, and that's in today's money. But once the railroad was built, a coast-to-coast trip became 85% less expensive. In summary, stagecoaches bridged gaps, facilitated communication, and contributed to the growth of the American West during this pivotal period. Railroads played a large role in the development of the United States from Industrial Revolution in the Northeast to the settlement of the West. The American railroad mania began with the founding of the first passenger and freight line in the nation of the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad in 1827, and the laying of the first stone ceremonies and beginning of its long construction headed westward over the obstacles of the Appalachian Mountains eastern chain the following year of 1828, and floored continuous railway building projects for the next 45 years until the financial panic of 1873, followed by a major economic depression, bankrupted many companies and temporarily stymied and ended growth. Although the antebellum South started early to build railways, It concentrated on short lines linking cotton regions to oceanic or river ports. And the absence of the interconnected network was a major handicap during the Civil War. The North and Midwest constructed networks that linked every city by 1860 before the war. In the heavily settled Midwestern Corn Belt, over 80% of farms were within 5 miles of a railway, facilitating the shipment of grain, hogs, and cattle to national and international markets. A large number of short lines were built, but due to the fast developing financial system based on Wall Street and oriented to railway bonds, the majority were consolidated into 20 trunk lines by 1890. State and local governments often subsidized lines, but rarely owned them. The founding fathers had envisioned the United States as a bastion of freedom that would cover territory reaching all the way across North American continent. Their descendants had not forgotten this desire and encouraged expansion into the Western territories through laws and rhetoric. The first wave of Western expansion accompanied these rise of manufacturing in New England and increasing mobility throughout the nation. As settlers moved to what is now the Midwest, the national infrastructure grew up around them, connecting the nation's cities, towns through a system of roads, canals, and railroads. Accompanying the rise, new methods of transportation came progress in the fields of agriculture and medicine as new machines were invented and new treatments for disease discovered. American culture developed in the form of writing, acting, and painting, and American intellectuals gained worldwide respect. Many painters and writers cited the American West as their inspiration, and the West began to symbolize American identity, rough and rugged individualism, willing to face new challenges. Thank you for going on this journey through the American West with us.